Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be diving into secondary objectives and how to score them with the Eldar. Specifically though, we're going to be focusing on 3 units that are arguably the best at scoring secondaries. And those are, of course, Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and Shadow Specters. Now, some of you might be wondering why Shadow Specters are on this list. After all, their primary role is typically damage. Well, I've actually found, as of recently, that they're one of the best secondary scoring units as well. And I'm actually going to talk about why they are in this video later on. Now, of course, there's a lot of other good secondary objective scorers, and I think the Eldar are kind of spoiled for secondary objective scorers, in my honest opinion. We have units like Shroud Runners, Wind Riders, Rangers. We even have single characters like Warlock Skyrunners or just solo Warlocks who can easily score secondary objectives, and even the Solitaire can. We just have a ton of fast units, and fast means good at scoring secondaries. However, while those units are good at scoring secondaries because of their speed when combined with Fire and Fade, these units here in particular are extra effective because of their ability not only to actually secure secondary objectives in unique ways, but also because of their ability to take up very little space on the battlefield, which if you look at other units like Shroud Runners, they do take up quite a bit more space. You know, Rangers even take up a little bit more space than these guys because these guys are on 25mm bases and Rangers are on 28.5. Of course, this is not that big of a deal. A couple of millimeters here and a couple of millimeters there isn't often going to make the difference between your unit being able to score a secondary or not. But when you're utilizing movements that, cover an immense distance, and in some cases you may have to fit your models within a very tiny space, given that your opponent is going to try to screen you so that you can't score those secondaries. So having those slightly smaller base sizes in a unit of 5 can sometimes actually matter a whole lot. And you'd honestly be surprised because against opponents that are actively trying to screen you, it's much harder to screen out a unit of 5 with 25mm bases than a unit of 3 Shroud Runners, for example, or, a unit of 3 Wind Riders. As sometimes those couple of millimeters that might not seem like that big of a deal can actually make a difference. Alright, so what are we going to talk about in today's video? So first of all, we're going to cover the abilities of Warp Spiders, Swooping Hawks, and Shadow Specters, kind of give you guys a review of what they do, and also talk about why these abilities are good at scoring secondary objectives. Lastly, we're going to go into some examples of how to score guaranteed secondary objectives with these units in very easy and simple to understand ways, and I'm also going to, of course, show you what that looks like on the battlefield. So first up, we have Warp Spiders, and of course, the Warp Spider's ability is Flicker Jump. So in your movement phase, when this unit makes a normal move, it can make a Flicker Jump. If it does until the end of the phase, its move characteristic is changed to 24 inches, but you must roll 1d6 after this. On a 1, the unit suffers 1 mortal wound. This unit is not eligible to declare a charge in a turn in which it makes a Flicker Jump. So you're actually going to find that a lot of times anyway, you're not going to want to charge your Warp Spiders in after using a Flicker Jump, especially when scoring on secondary objectives. Yes, the Exarch has Power Blades, which is decent, but, if you charge into something that's maybe a little bit too tough for the unit and the unit gets wiped out, you're not going to be able to score those secondary points. Now, obviously, rolling a 1 on this does suck, but it really doesn't change what the Warp Spiders can do in a single turn, which is good. I'm glad it's not something catastrophic that would, possibly end the unit if you rolled that 1. So, suffering a mortal wound does suck, but you can always put it on the Exarch and not lose a model, or in some rare cases, it actually might help you fit into a small area outside of enemy engagement range so that you can then score secondary objectives. I've had this happen to me exactly one time in a game against my buddy where he had me pretty well screened out, but he specifically screened them out as a unit of 5. And he put his incinerators in a position where he would be able to overwatch against at least 1 model in the unit if I put them in the back corner, but he was also outside a line of sight. He was behind obscuring terrain himself. So when I rolled that 1, instead of taking it on the Exarch like I usually do, I was able to just kill off a model, which put him barely outside of Overwatch range, and he wasn't able to use all of his models in the unit to fire Overwatch against me. In any case, it's a very powerful ability. That's probably not going to happen to you guys all too often. It's a very rare, kind of fringe case there. But, do be aware of it. Those are some of the small things that can actually win you games, believe it or not. Okay, so our next unit is Shadow Specters, and they have the Shade of Twilight ability. So in your shooting phase, after this unit is shot, if it is not within engagement range of one or more enemy units, it can make a normal move of up to 6 inches. Of course, if it does so until the end of the turn, the unit is not eligible to clear a charge. But it can do a lot of other things, like use Fire and Fade, for example. Now, this ability is typically used defensively to move the unit back behind obscuring terrain once it is shot, and that is the best way to use it in my humble opinion. However, there are some opportunities that will arise in game, which will allow your Shadow Specters to do much more than just move, shoot, and move again. It will allow you to transverse a large part of the board, fire on a unit, and then Fire and Fade onto the objective. These guys do a lot of damage, so if your opponent leaves it open, these guys can actually easily steal an objective. And in some of my lists where I have multiple units of these guys, 2 or 3, I might actually use one of the units for this exact purpose. Might stage it accordingly so that if I draw a Capture Enemy Outpost on turn 1, I can have my units in a position to where I can actually score that objective with this unit. And of course, I'm going to show you guys how that works later in this video. Lastly, we have Swooping Hawks and their ability is Skyleap. Now, a little bit about Swooping Hawks before I truly get into their ability. They are one of my favorite units, not only in this edition, but in many different editions. I remember picking up the 3rd edition Eldar Codex way back in the day when I first started playing the faction, and reading the description of these guys as a quote-unquote harassment unit, only to learn that they were actually a Space Marine murdering unit. They would just basically run into assault with Space Marines and kill every single one of them. Not the regular Swooping Hawks, but the Exarch. So that, of course, was really funny to kind of, read the description in the book and see how they were supposed to perform and then get a completely opposite use of the unit. A lot of the older rules were very much like that. But in their current iteration, they pretty much do exactly as you would expect. They hop around the battlefield, scoring secondary objectives and harassing enemy light infantry. So what does Skyleap do? So basically what it does at the end of your opponent's turn, and of course this could be any turn, even their first turn, if this unit is not within engagement range of one or more enemy units, you can remove this unit from the battlefield and place it into strategic reserve. And since they have the deep strike ability as well, they're actually able to come onto the board via deep strike. And because of the clarifications that GW made to these types of abilities, they can actually come in on turn 1, which would be your first turn. So at the end of the enemy's turn, they hop back in reserves, and the very next turn, they come in during your reinforcement step as normal. And for those of you wondering, it is and has been clarified in the rules commentary that they can do this, just like Mandrakes can. So Mandrakes, if they go second or if you go second, you actually get to bring these guys in on your first turn, which can be extremely powerful because your opponent might not actually have the means to screen out every single one of your scoring units. So if you do go second, your opponent has to make some hard decisions about what units they want to move up and stage for later, and what units, of course, they want to keep back and screen out your Swooping Hawks with. Now, obviously, this ability is very good. It forces your opponent to think extra hard about what units they want to keep back, but it also gives you the opportunity to charge, which is another thing your opponent has to worry about, right? They don't want to leave a unsecured lone operative in the backfield that doesn't have fights first, because that operative could easily die. 20 shooting attacks with lethal hits and a charge with a power weapon, and of course the Swooping Hawks aren't great at combat, but against something small and fairly fragile, they can easily destroy it. I have actually killed quite a few assassins with this unit by deep striking just outside of 9 inches, using a 6 of a fate dice and getting that 3+ to charge, and of course wiping out that assassin after shooting it. And typically speaking, you can just kill the assassin with shooting alone, but sometimes you're going to want that extra movement to get onto an objective or to score a secondary or something like that. So you might want to always keep that option available. In fact, there have been games where I have gone second. I have, kind of moved these guys back into reserve. And then once I came in, even if the backfield was screened out, I was able to shoot something, weaken it enough to where my Swooping Hawks could charge in, finish it off and actually be in the enemy's deployment zone for things like behind enemy lines. So there are so many different ways in which this ability can be used to score secondary objectives. You just need to be wary of them. All right, so what makes these abilities good at scoring secondary objectives in general? So each of these abilities focus on transversing rapidly across the board, and any unit that is able to move very quickly from a safe position on the board, either from reserve or behind, obscuring terrain, to a scoring one, so being able to score on secondary objectives, are very desirable in competitive play. If you've ever wondered why Marine players love Inceptors so much at the competitive level, it's not because they do a ton of damage, guys. In fact, they're one of the weakest units for straight up damage in the entire book, right? Just for the points. But their ability to deep strike within 3 inches and also deal some damage while doing it is very good, especially when it comes to the secondary objective game. And of course, being able to transverse rapidly across the battlefield means that several secondary objectives that are based on being in the enemy's deployment zone or the center of the board or the corners of the battlefield are all of a sudden available for you to score right off the bat. And there are simply armies in the game that are just not going to be able to do this. And those armies, typically when they draw something like behind enemy lines, it's a wasted turn. And that is one of the greatest things about the Eldar, is that if you do draw into these secondaries early on in the game, you can easily score them and also just kind of ruin your opponent's designs right off the bat at the same time. Okay, so as I promised you guys, I am going to show you examples of how to score guaranteed secondary objectives with these units. And again, there are so many different ways that you can score secondary objectives with these units, but I'm going to show you guys a few of them that are probably a little bit more crystal clear, and hopefully the examples will kind of give you some insight into when these opportunities will arise. So like always, we are going to be using terrain layout number 1. However, I am going to change this soon, and for my next video, I'm going to go ahead and switch it up and do a couple of different deployment types and kind of change it up just a little bit. All right, so the first example I'm going to give you guys is Swooping Hawks being able to score things like deploy teleport homers, investigate signals, and behind enemy lines on turn 1, or your first turn if you decide to skyleap them during your opponent's first turn. However, there is a problem here. A good opponent will screen out the corners of their battlefield to make sure units like Swooping Hawks can't actually get into the enemy deployment zone. And this often means that for the first couple of turns of the game, your Swooping Hawks can be, kind of just in your own backfield, just chilling, waiting for an opportunity to score a secondary objective. So we're going to need something else to be able to draw enemy units out so that your Swooping Hawks can easily score. In come Rangers or Striking Scorpions. You can use Rangers infiltrating up the battlefield or Striking Scorpions to bait enemies into moving forward to engage them, and this can open up space in your opponent's backline for the Hawks to deploy and score. So in this particular example, we have a unit of Striking Scorpions or Rangers, up to you, infiltrating behind that L-shaped ruin right there on the right-hand side of the battlefield. Now, the opponent doesn't want that unit to stay there, of course. They want to eliminate it, so they're going to move forward to engage. Now, they might not move forward all their units, but if they only move forward that 5-man infantry unit, that might not be enough to kill the Scorpions or Rangers. Of course, because Rangers can use a D6 movement when those units get close to, kind of get out of line of sight or move away. And if it's Scorpions, they have a 3+ armor save, so there's a decent chance you will be able to survive a little bit of bolter fire and, also kill that unit in return when your turn comes around. So your opponent may use additional units to move forward. Perhaps a Dreadnought that was screening out the backfield might move up to roast some Striking Scorpions or Rangers out of cover. This gives you a perfect opportunity to drop your Swooping Hawks in the back. And then, of course, capitalize on any secondary objectives that you might have drawn. Warp Spiders, on the other hand, don't really operate well out of reserves. Instead, they use their flicker jump ability to score on objectives, especially when combined with Fire and Fade. This is especially effective when your opponent knows that Swooping Hawks are in reserve and screens out your backfield accordingly. Warp Spiders can therefore move from your own deployment zone from a place of safety behind obscuring terrain into a position where they're behind a wall, Again, enemies cannot overwatch if they cannot see. And then they can fire and fade into the opponent's backfield to score on secondary objectives as well. The advantage to this is that fire and fade, remember, does not proc overwatch. Overwatch is only in the movement phase or in the charge phase, and fire and fade happens in the shooting phase. At the end of the shooting phase, of course. Now, the other advantage to this is that they can overwatch after they score that objective. So at the beginning of your opponent's turn, if they decide to move units in response to the warp spiders, they can, of course, shoot overwatch and deal some pretty good damage. Warp spiders don't have the best damage out there, but pretty reliably you can assume that you'll kill a couple Marines. Alright, so the last example is using Shadow Specters to essentially capture enemy outpost. Now, this is one of the hardest objectives to score on the first turn, and a lot of players will simply draw it and be frustrated that they drew it because oftentimes it's unscorable. But it's not unscorable for the Eldar. So basically what you do here is you move your Shadow Specters 12 inches forward so that you have line of sight on the enemy objective. Of course, you want to deploy your Shadow Specters on the enemy's weak side, the side with the exposed objective. And essentially you just want to make sure that your Shadow Specters can see the enemy unit on the opposing objective. And typically you want to be within 18 inches. You're also going to move up other units to support. So a common tactic for at least the friends in my gaming group, and I've seen this elsewhere as well, especially in competitive play, is on the first turn of the game, you park a transport in front of an objective and you park an infantry unit behind it. This is a common opening move for Sisters of Battle. Battle Sisters are a little bit fragile, so they do need that little bit of extra protection from a Rhino blocking line of sight. However, Battle Sisters also generate miracle dice when they're, controlling an objective, much like Guardians. So they're going to want to be on their home objective. Now, this gives you a rare opportunity because we have a lot of anti-large weaponry in our army that is fast and can draw line of sight to that Rhino. Rhinos are not particularly tough. Even if your opponent has miracle dice, a Warwalker and a Falcon combined should be able to take it out quite easily. Especially if you're using your own fate dice to guarantee max damage. Next, your Shadow Specters are going to open fire on the Battle Sisters behind. On average dice, 5 Shadow Specters will kill about 9 Sisters of Battle. And of course, you can easily pick off the remaining model with any number of small units that you have at your disposal. Next, you're going to move 6 inches with your Shadow Specters. As they did shoot, you're able to move that 6 inches. And instead of moving back behind terrain, you're actually going to move forward. You're going to move forward closer to the enemy's home objective. Now, you probably see where I'm going at this point. The Shadow Specter unit is now going to fire and fade onto that objective and score capture enemy outpost. The Rhino is destroyed, the Sisters of Battle is destroyed, and typically speaking, your opponent is not going to have enough space to fit more models on that objective. At most, you might see something like a Canoness joining the unit of Sisters of Battle, but even then, Shadow Specters out OC the Canoness on the objective. So you're still going to be able to score. Now, the Shadow Specters at this point are going to die, most likely. But you can also at this point use them to screen out your opponent. If your opponent has any other units hiding behind that ruin near their home objective, you can of course screen them out a little bit. And that way you get the maximum use out of your Shadow Specters. Now, on the other side of the battlefield, you can do a little bit of, kind of distraction tactics. You can have a unit of Rangers or Striking Scorpions infiltrating up the board to tie up enemy vehicles. Enemy vehicles love to hide behind that little L-shaped ruin. I often find that my opponents are, kind of deploying indirect fire weapons there. Things like Exorcist battle tanks, basilisks, and, kind of other artillery pieces because it's a very protected side of the board. So if your opponent leaves it open, Rangers, Striking Scorpions can tie up that artillery and make it hard for your opponent to actually counterattack the Falcon or the Warwalker and stuff like that. And there you have it. Basically, you can use Shadow Specters like this to score an easy capture enemy outpost on turn 1. And I know a lot of you guys have stories like this where you use quick Eldar units to achieve this objective on the first turn. And this is really how you should be thinking about using Shadow Specters if you indeed do draw that secondary. Now, there is going to be games where you just don't draw that secondary at all. And, you won't be able to pull off this maneuver. But it's always good to be prepared, and it's always good to know what your units are capable of. So, in conclusion, there is a very good reason why these 3 units are included in competitive lists, often in multiples. All 3 units can score on various secondary objectives from turn 1, and with Fire and Fade, they can also avoid Overwatch, which is a huge detriment for fragile infantry. And lastly, being able to know how and when to score secondaries is key to the success with the Eldar. You need to be flexible in your thought processes when you're using units like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and Shadow Specters. And you do need to think about multiple different kinds of avenues to score those objectives. So in the rare case that your Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, or Shadow Specters won't be able to score a certain objective on turn 1, you can always turn to other types of units as well. We have things like Shroud Runners, Wind Riders, who can also do it fairly easily. And I know I've sung the praises of Shroud Runners quite a bit, but they are a unit that can kind of fill in a gap in your secondary scoring. So if you're finding that your opponents are really good at screening out your Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks turn 1 or turn 2 even, and you find yourself having to settle for, a mini deploy teleport homer in the middle of the battlefield often, or, you can't quite get 2 units behind enemy lines on turn 1 to be able to score the max on behind enemy lines, then maybe think about including a unit of Shroud Runners that can scout up the board and then, of course, move a total of 28 inches afterward, with their normal movement and Fire and Fade, of course. It's going to be a rare few opponents that are going to be able to screen both Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and potentially Shroud Runners on turn 1. Unless you're going against some sort of infantry swarm or something like that, in which case, shit happens. Shit happens. Sometimes you go up against those types of lists that you're just not going to be able to score those kind of objectives on turn 1. And you know what? That's definitely okay too, because chances are that swarm list is not going to be able to, score the same objectives on turn 1 as well. And the great news about swarm lists is they do move quickly up the battlefield. So on turn 2, if you keep that objective, on turn 2 or turn 3, you can easily score those objectives and make up those points. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Our next video is going to be how to score primary objectives with lone operatives and other types of units like that. I will be talking about that in the next video because, of course, we need to learn how to score primary objectives with more than just the Avatar of Khaine and Wraith units. Because oftentimes what happens is when players run up against a counter to Wraith Blades or the Avatar of Khaine, they're not able to hold primary, and they typically do poorly afterwards because they have no backup plan. So we're going to talk about how to score primary objectives with lone operatives and how to find success that way. I'm also going to be posting the video for the Eldar Community Painting Contest within the next week or so stay tuned for that as well. Once again, I also want to thank my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategies, tactics, and of course hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page as well. So if you want to grab some Eldar inspired apparel on the channel store page, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will also leave the links for those in the description. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Peace out, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.